Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds romantic until you actually think about it. Getting absolutely hammered in a medieval tavern. Not the cosy pub from your favourite fantasy show, not the candlelit alehouse where the bard plays a lute and everyone's having a jolly time. I'm talking about the real medieval tavern. Dark, sticky, smelling like a barn floor mixed with regret, and filled with people who haven't bathed since the Crusades. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, and who's still awake at 3 AM on a Tuesday. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's pause and think about this. Have you ever wondered what getting drunk in the Middle Ages was actually like? Was the beer any good, or was it basically liquid bread with an attitude? Did people actually enjoy the taste, or were they just desperate to forget they had to work in a field tomorrow? What did you do for entertainment when there was no TV, no phones, just a room full of sweaty strangers and questionable meat on a stick? Could you survive a night in a medieval tavern without catching something contagious, starting a fight, or accidentally drinking something that wasn't supposed to be consumed by humans? Would you make it home? Or would you wake up face down in a pile of hay with no memory and a stolen chicken under your arm? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1347. You're standing outside a tavern in a small English village. The door is crooked, the sign is unreadable, and inside someone just threw up on the floor. Welcome to your night out. Let's start with the building. Medieval taverns weren't charming. They were dark, draughty wooden structures that doubled as inns, brothels, and occasionally crime scenes. The floor was dirt or rotting wood covered in rushes that hadn't been changed in months. The ceiling was low enough to give you a concussion if you stood up too fast. There were no windows, or if there were, they were covered with oiled cloth that let in approximately zero light, and somehow all the cold. The whole place smelled like spilled beer, wet dog, smoke, and something else you couldn't quite identify but deeply regretted inhaling. The walls were made of wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and plastered with mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Yes, dung. It was considered an excellent insulator, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval building standards. These walls were thin, cracked, and constantly leaking. If it rained outside, it rained inside. Just slower and with more mould. The whole structure creaked and groaned like it was one strong wind, away from collapsing into a pile of splinters and regret. Lighting was minimal and depressing. A few tallow candles if you were lucky, but more often it was just the glow from the central hearth. Tallow, by the way, was made from animal fat and smelled like burning hair. So the ambience was less cosy tavern, more dim cave where bad things happen. Your eyes adjusted eventually, but only enough to make out shadowy figures and the occasional rat scurrying past your feet. Romantic, really. The furniture was rough-hewn and filthy. Long wooden tables, scarred with knife marks and burns, stretched across the room. Benches lined either side. No backs, no cushions, just hard wood that made your tailbone cry after 20 minutes. If you were lucky, you'd get a stool near the fire. If not, you'd be crammed in with strangers, elbows knocking, trying to find space to set down your mug without spilling it into someone's lap. And those tables, sticky, always sticky. A mysterious combination of spilled ale, grease, and possibly blood from last night's brawl. The ceiling beams were low and blackened with soot from years of smoke rising from the hearth. If you were taller than average, you'd spend the whole night hunched over like a medieval Quasimodo, praying you didn't stand up too fast and knock yourself unconscious. And the smoke, it never left. There was no chimney, or if there was, it didn't work. The smoke just hung there in a thick, eye-watering cloud, making everyone cough and squint while pretending this was perfectly normal. And then there was the smell, a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale beer, wet wool, livestock, because yes, sometimes animals wandered in, wood smoke, and human waste from the privy out back, which was really just a hole in the ground. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home. The kind of smell that made you reconsider all your life choices but also somehow made the ale taste better. So there you were, standing in a dim, smoky, foul-smelling wooden box filled with strangers, questionable hygiene, and structural instability, and somehow this was the highlight of your week. Because in the Middle Ages the bar was low, literally and figuratively. The crowd at a medieval tavern was a cross-section of society's most interesting failures. You had farmers who'd just finished a 12-hour shift in the mud, travelling merchants who hadn't seen their wives in months and had no intention of changing that, beggars who wandered in hoping someone would leave a cup unattended, maybe a minor noble slumming it because his castle was too boring, and if you were really unlucky, a group of soldiers fresh off some campaign, still armed, still aggressive, and absolutely not in the mood for your opinion. Everyone was tired, everyone was dirty, and everyone was here for the same reason: to forget. The farmers were easy to spot. They still had dirt under their fingernails, actually dirt everywhere, and they moved with the slow, exhausted shuffle of people whose backs had given up years ago. They'd scrape together a few coins, stumble into the tavern after sunset and sit quietly in the corner, nursing their ale like it was liquid salvation. Which, in a way, it was. These were men who woke up before dawn, worked until their hands bled, and went to bed knowing they'd do it all again tomorrow. The tavern was their one escape, and they weren't about to waste it on conversation. Then you had the merchants, loud, overconfident, and wearing clothes that were slightly too nice for a place where the floor was 30% mud. They'd travelled from town to town selling wool, spices, or whatever people were desperate enough to buy, and now they were flush with coin and bad decisions. They'd buy rounds for strangers, tell exaggerated stories about bandits they'd totally fought off, and flirt aggressively with anyone who made eye contact. They were the kind of people who'd wake up the next morning missing half their profits and all their dignity. Beggars drifted in and out like ghosts. They didn't have money for ale, but they had hope, and that was almost as good. They'd linger near the door, eyes scanning the room for unattended mugs or charitable drunks. Sometimes they'd get lucky. Someone would take pity and buy them a drink. Or they'd swipe a half-empty cup when no one was looking. Sometimes they'd get kicked out. It was a gamble every time, but honestly, their whole lives were a gamble. So what was one more? If you saw a noble in a medieval tavern, something had gone wrong. Either they'd lost a bet, were hiding from their wife, or had developed a taste for slumming it with the common folk. They'd sit there trying to blend in, but their clean hands and lack of visible lice gave them away immediately. Some peasants resented them. Others saw an opportunity. Nobles had money, and drunk nobles had money they were willing to spend. Either way, their presence changed the energy of the room. Suddenly everyone was a little more aware, a little more careful. But the most dangerous crowd, soldiers, fresh off a campaign, still wearing bits of armour, still carrying weapons and still running on adrenaline and unprocessed trauma. They were loud, aggressive, and had zero patience for anything they perceived as disrespect. They'd drink hard, laugh harder, and start fights over absolutely nothing. A wrong look, a bumped shoulder, someone sitting in their spot. If soldiers walked into the tavern, smart people finished their drinks quickly and left. Everyone else just hoped they wouldn't be the ones getting punched. This was your crowd, exhausted, desperate, dangerous, and deeply human. A room full of people trying to survive the only way they knew how, one ale at a time. Medieval ale wasn't a craft brew. It wasn't hoppy or smooth or refreshing. It was thick, murky, and tasted like someone fermented a loaf of bread in a bucket and called it a day. Because that's basically what happened. Brewing was done at home, often by women called alewives, using barley, water, and whatever herbs they had lying around. Hops weren't common yet, so the flavour was rustic. Some batches were drinkable, others were basically punishment, but you drank it anyway because the alternative was water, and water in medieval Europe was trying to kill you. The brewing process was straightforward, but not exactly sanitary. You'd take malted barley, crush it up, mix it with hot water, and let it sit until it decided to become alcohol. Then you'd add herbs for flavour, maybe yarrow, mugwort, or heather if you were feeling fancy. These weren't for taste, they were for preservation, and to mask the fact that your ale tasted like wet grain. The mixture would ferment in large wooden barrels or clay pots, often sitting out in the open where flies, dust, and occasionally small animals could contribute to the final product. Quality control was not a priority. The colour ranged from pale yellow to dark brown, depending on how long the barley was roasted and how much the alewife cared that day. Consistency? Forget it. Every batch was different. One week you'd get something light and almost pleasant. The next week it'd be thick as porridge and taste like someone boiled old shoes. You never knew what you were getting until it hit your tongue, and by then it was too late to complain. Texture-wise, medieval ale was closer to a thin gruel than a modern beer. It wasn't clear. It was cloudy, with bits floating in it. Grain husks, sediment, mystery chunks. You didn't question the chunks, you just drank around them or pretended they added character. Some people would strain their ale through cloth before serving it, but most taverns didn't bother. If you were thirsty enough, you'd drink it as is and thank the universe it wasn't worse. The alcohol content varied wildly. Small beer, the stuff people drank all day, was weak, maybe 1 to 3% alcohol, enough to keep you safe from contaminated water, but not enough to get you drunk unless you really committed to the cause. Regular ale was stronger, around 4 to 6%, enough to give you a solid buzz after a few mugs. And then there was strong ale, the dangerous stuff, brewed for special occasions or for people who wanted to make very bad decisions very quickly. That could hit 8 or 9%, and it would lay you flat if you weren't careful. Taste-wise, it was earthy, grainy, and faintly sour. Some batches had a sweetness to them from the malt, others tasted bitter from the herbs, and some just tasted like fermented sadness. But here's the thing, you got used to it. After your third or fourth mug, your taste buds gave up and your brain started focusing on the warmth spreading through your chest, and the fact that your life suddenly seemed slightly less terrible. The ale wasn't good, it was functional. It kept you hydrated, it kept you buzzed, and most importantly, it kept you coming back. Because in a world where everything else was trying to kill you, at least the ale was on your side. Sort of. Let's address the elephant in the tavern. Everyone drank beer. All day, every day. Not because they were all raging alcoholics, though some definitely were, but because beer was safer than water. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and various medieval surprises. Beer, because it was boiled during brewing, was relatively safe. So you drank small beer for breakfast, regular beer for lunch, and if you were feeling fancy, strong beer for dinner. Children drank it. Monks drank it. Nuns drank it. Pregnant women drank it. It was basically medieval Gatorade, except it also made you tipsy. The water situation in medieval Europe was genuinely terrifying. Towns and villages didn't have water treatment plants or sewage systems. They had rivers that doubled as toilets, garbage dumps, and washing stations. Upstream, someone was tanning leather with urine and brain matter. Downstream, someone else was filling their bucket for dinner. Wells weren't much better. They were shallow, unprotected, pro-sur, and located disturbingly close to privies and animal pens. Drinking water was essentially playing Russian roulette with dysentery, cholera, and parasites that would make your intestines their permanent home. Beer solved this problem by accident. The brewing process required boiling water, which killed most of the nasty microorganisms trying to murder you. Nobody understood germ theory yet. That wouldn't come along for another few centuries. But they did notice that people who drank beer got sick less often than people who drank water. So beer became the default beverage for everyone, from sunrise to bedtime. Small beer was the breakfast drink of choice. Weak, watery, barely alcoholic. It was what you'd pour for your kids before sending them off to do child labour in the fields. Yes, children drank beer. Starting around age 5 or 6, they'd graduate from milk to small beer and never look back. It sounds insane by modern standards, but in a world where the alternative was cholera, it was actually the responsible parenting choice. Parents weren't trying to get their kids drunk. They were trying to keep them alive. By midday, you'd switch to regular ale, a bit stronger, enough to take the edge off another grueling shift of manual labour. Workers would break for lunch, grab some bread and cheese, and wash it down with ale. Employers sometimes provided it as part of wages, which meant you were literally being paid in beer. Not the worst deal, honestly, except when your boss decided to water it down to save money, at which point you'd be back to basically drinking risky water anyway. Monks and nuns were some of the most dedicated drinkers in medieval Europe. Monasteries brewed their own beer, often the best in the region, and consumed it liberally. They'd drink it during meals, between prayers, and sometimes instead of prayers if the abbot wasn't paying attention. Monks had a daily ale allowance, sometimes as much as 1 gallon per day. That's 8 pints, every single day. They called it liquid bread and justified it as necessary sustenance during fasting periods. God would understand. Even pregnant women drank beer because, again, what was the alternative? Water that might kill them and the baby? At least beer was relatively safe. Nobody knew about fetal alcohol syndrome yet, and honestly they had bigger problems, like the plague. So yes, Everyone in medieval Europe was mildly buzzed most of the time. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival. A society running on low-grade intoxication. Trying desperately not to die of dehydration. Cheers! You didn't walk into a medieval tavern and browse a drink menu. There was one option. Ale. Maybe two if the tavern also had wine, which was rare and expensive and usually reserved for people who didn't smell like turnips. You didn't order by name. You just sat down, and someone, usually the tavern keeper's wife, would bring you a wooden cup or a ceramic mug filled with whatever they'd brewed that week. If it tasted like feet, too bad. If it had things floating in it, you drank around them. Complaining wasn't really an option, unless you wanted to get kicked out or worse, serve the batch they kept in the back for people they didn't like. The entire ordering process was refreshingly simple. You walked in, you sat down. Someone noticed you existed. They brought you ale. That was it. No waiting for a server to take your order, no asking about seasonal specials or whether they had anything gluten-free. The ale was what it was, and you were going to drink it. If you wanted a second mug, you'd catch someone's eye and gesture vaguely in the direction of your empty cup. If you were ignored, you'd wait. Patience was a virtue, especially when the tavern keeper was also breaking up a fight, tending the fire, and stopping a dog from eating someone's dinner. Payment was equally straightforward. You paid per mug, usually a penny or two depending on the strength of the ale and how generous the tavern keeper was feeling. Some places operated on a tab system. You'd drink all night and settle up before leaving. This required a certain level of trust, which is why tavern keepers had excellent memories and zero tolerance for people who tried to sneak out without paying. If you couldn't pay, you'd work it off, washing mugs, hauling barrels, or mucking out the stables. Nobody drank for free. Wine was a different beast entirely. Most taverns didn't carry it because it was imported, expensive, and frankly too fancy for their clientele. Wine was for nobles, clergy, and merchants who wanted everyone to know they had money. If a tavern did have wine, it was served in smaller portions, cost significantly more, and came with a side of judgment. You'd order it, and everyone would turn to look at you like you'd just announced you were the king's cousin. The wine itself was often sour, watered down, or mixed with honey and spices to mask the fact that it had gone bad weeks ago. But you'd paid for it, so you'd drink it and pretend it was sophisticated. There was no customization. You couldn't ask for your ale served cold. There was no ice, and even if there was, nobody was wasting it on your drink. You couldn't request it warm either, because it was already room temperature, and room temperature in a medieval tavern was whatever the fire and 40 unwashed bodies had managed to achieve. You couldn't ask for it in a clean mug because clean was relative, and they'd already given you the best one. And complaints? Forget it. If you mentioned that the ale tasted off, the tavern keeper would tell you it tasted exactly like ale, and maybe you were the problem. If you said there was something floating in it, they'd tell you to fish it out and stop being dramatic. The only acceptable complaint was if the ale was so watered down it was basically water, at which point you could demand your money back, or threaten to report them to the ale taster, the local official responsible for quality control. But even then, you'd make an enemy, and in a small medieval town making enemies was a terrible idea. So you sat, you drank what you were given, and you were grateful it wasn't water. Your drink came in a vessel that had seen better days. If you were lucky, you got a ceramic mug. If not, a wooden cup that had been used by 50 other people and never washed. There were no glasses. Glass was expensive, fragile, and reserved for rich people who didn't hang out in taverns. The cup you were handed had cracks, stains, and possibly a dried insect stuck to the rim. You didn't look too closely, you just drank. And if you were smart, you wiped the rim with your sleeve first. Not that your sleeve was clean, but at least it was your dirt. Wooden cups were the most common option, and they were absolutely disgusting. Carved from a single piece of wood, usually oak, beech, or whatever tree was nearby, they'd been in circulation for years, maybe decades. The wood was porous, which meant it absorbed every liquid that had ever touched it. Ale, wine, someone's backwash, possibly vomit. It all soaked in, creating a permanent funk that no amount of rinsing could remove. Not that anyone really rinsed them. After you finished your drink, the tavern keeper would dump out any remaining liquid, maybe give it a quick swipe with a rag that was dirtier than the cup, and hand it to the next person. Hygiene wasn't invented yet. The rims were the worst part. Chipped, splintered, and rough from years of use, they'd scrape against your lips as you drank. If you weren't careful, you'd end up with a wooden splinter embedded in your mouth, which was both painful and a great way to get an infection. But you couldn't exactly send it back to the kitchen. You'd just pick the splinter out with your fingernail, spit it on the floor, and keep drinking. Because what else were you going to do? Go thirsty? Ceramic mugs were slightly better, but only slightly. They were heavier, sturdier, and didn't absorb flavours the way wood did. But they were still filthy. The glaze was often cracked or chipped, creating little crevices where grime could hide. You'd peer into your mug and see a brownish residue clinging to the sides. Was it from the ale, or from the last person who used it? Impossible to say. You'd swirl the liquid around, hoping it would dislodge anything suspicious, and then you'd drink it anyway because you'd already paid. Some taverns used leather jacks, mugs made from hardened, tarred leather. These were lightweight, nearly indestructible, and absolutely revolting. The tar lining was supposed to make them waterproof, but it also gave everything a faint chemical taste. Plus, the leather absorbed smells just like wood, so your ale would have subtle notes of sweat, smoke, and despair. But they didn't break, which made them popular with tavern keepers, who were tired of replacing crockery every time someone got drunk and threw a mug at the wall. If you were really unlucky, you'd get a communal drinking horn. Yes, a literal hollowed-out animal horn passed around the table like some kind of medieval hazing ritual. You couldn't set it down. It didn't have a flat base, so once you started drinking, you had to finish it or pass it along. And everyone's lips had been on the horn. Every single person. It was like a bacterial handshake, except wetter and more binding. There was no such thing as your cup. You didn't get to keep it between rounds. The second you finished, someone else was drinking from it. Personal space, personal property. These were modern luxuries. In a medieval tavern, everything was shared, whether you liked it or not. Cups, benches, diseases. It was all part of the experience. So you'd take your cracked, stained, splinter-filled vessel, toast to your own questionable decisions, and drink deeply. Because honestly, after the first mug, you stopped noticing the taste of someone else's saliva. The person running the tavern was usually the owner, and they were not having a good time. They brewed the ale, served the drinks, broke up fights, cleaned up vomit, and occasionally testified in court when someone got stabbed. They were part-time landlords, full-time babysitters, and had zero patience for nonsense. If you caused trouble, you were out. If you couldn't pay, you were also out. And if you died on the premises, well, that was a whole legal headache they really didn't need. Most tavern keepers were tough, practical, and deeply tired of everyone's garbage. Running a medieval tavern wasn't a job, it was a lifestyle, and that lifestyle was exhausting. You were up before dawn, brewing the day's ale, hauling water, chopping firewood, and preparing whatever questionable food you'd be serving later. Then you'd open the doors and spend the next 12 to 16 hours dealing with humanity at its absolute worst. Drunk farmers, belligerent soldiers, merchants trying to haggle over the price of ale like it was a negotiation, and all of them acting like you were personally responsible for their misery. Most taverns were family operations. The keeper's wife did much of the brewing and serving. Their children hauled barrels, washed cups, sort of, and learned early that people were terrible. If you didn't have family, you hired help, but trustworthy employees were rare. Most people who wanted to work in a tavern were either desperate or planning to steal from you, so you did everything yourself and developed the emotional resilience of a stone wall. Tavern keepers had to be tough, physically and mentally. Fights broke out constantly. And you couldn't just call the police. There were no police. You were the police. You'd wade into a brawl, grab the biggest troublemaker by the collar, and physically drag them outside. If they resisted, you'd hit them with whatever was handy. A wooden club, a fire poker, a stale loaf of bread. Violence was part of the job description. You learned quickly that hesitation got you hurt and mercy got you robbed. But you also had to be diplomatic. You couldn't throw out everyone who caused problems, or you'd have no customers left. You had to know when to tolerate a loudmouth and when to shut them down, when to extend credit and when to demand payment up front, when to pour someone another drink and when to cut them off before they started a riot. It was a constant balancing act, and one wrong move could cost you your business, your reputation, or your teeth. The legal responsibilities were a nightmare. Taverns were heavily regulated. You needed a license to sell ale, which cost money and required approval from local authorities. Ale tasters would show up unannounced to test your brew, and if it was watered down or too weak, you'd be fined. If someone got injured or killed in your tavern, you could be held liable. If stolen goods were found on your property, you'd be questioned. If a fugitive was caught hiding in your inn, you'd be accused of harbouring criminals. The law was always watching, and it was never on your side. And then there were the deaths. Because yes, people died in taverns. Heart attacks from too much ale, choking on food, stab wounds from fights. Sometimes they'd just collapse and never get up. When that happened, you had to report it, deal with the body, answer questions from the coroner, and hope nobody blamed you. Every death meant lost business, bad reputation, and paperwork that didn't technically exist yet, but somehow still felt endless. Tavern keepers didn't do this job because they loved people. They did it because they owned the building, knew how to brew, and had no better options. They were the glue holding the community's social life together, and their reward was a front row seat to humanity's worst behaviour every single night. So when you walked into that tavern, you showed respect, because the person behind that bar had seen things that would break you, and they were still standing. Barely. Medieval ale wasn't as strong as modern beer, but if you drank enough of it, and everyone did, you absolutely got drunk. It crept up on you. First, you felt warm, then you felt chatty. Then you felt like you could definitely win a fistfight with the blacksmith. The room got louder, the jokes got funnier, your problems seemed smaller, and somewhere around your fourth or fifth mug, you stopped caring that you had to wake up before dawn to plough a field. This was the point of the tavern, not the drink itself, but the forgetting. And for a few hours, it worked. The first mug always went down easy. You'd take a long pull, feel the cool liquid hit your empty stomach, and immediately feel better about everything. Your back still ached from working all day, but now it was a distant ache. Something happening to someone else. The smoky air in the tavern didn't bother you as much. The smell of unwashed bodies became almost comforting. You'd settle onto your bench, look around at the other tired souls doing exactly what you were doing and think, yes, this is good. By the second mug, you were warming up in every sense. Your cheeks flushed, your muscles relaxed. You started noticing the people around you, not as threats or strangers, but as potential friends. Maybe you'd nod at the farmer next to you. Maybe he'd nod back. And just like that, you'd formed a bond. You didn't need to talk. You both understood. You were here for the same reason, to survive another day by forgetting the last one. The third mug was where things got interesting. Your tongue loosened. Suddenly you had opinions about the harvest, about the Lord, about your neighbour's pig that kept getting into your garden. You'd share these opinions loudly with anyone who'd listen, and in a tavern full of drunk people, everyone listened. Or at least pretended to. Conversations overlapped into a glorious cacophony of slurred complaints, bad jokes, and the occasional singing. Nothing profound was said, but it felt profound. That was the magic. By the fourth mug, your coordination started to betray you. You'd reach for your cup and miss slightly. You'd stand up to visit the privy and realise the floor wasn't quite where you remembered it being. But your confidence? Sky high. You were funnier than you'd ever been. Smarter too, and definitely stronger. That blacksmith who'd been sitting quietly in the corner? You could take him. Absolutely. You wouldn't, because you weren't stupid. But you could. Theoretically. The fifth mug was the point of no return. The room tilted gently, like the whole tavern was on a boat. Faces blurred together. Time became slippery. Had you been here for an hour or 4 hours? Impossible to say. Your problems, the ones that had weighed on you all day, all week, all year, evaporated like steam. The taxes you couldn't pay, someone else's problem, the crops that might fail, future you could worry about that. Right now, in this smoky, crowded, filthy room, you were free. This was why people came back. Not for the taste of the ale, which ranged from tolerable to punishment. Not for the ambiance, which was objectively terrible, but for this feeling. The slow, warm descent into not caring. For a few precious hours, the medieval world with all its brutality, unfairness, and grinding exhaustion couldn't touch you. You were drunk. You were among people who understood, and that was enough. The tavern wasn't an escape from reality. It was a brief truce with it, and sometimes that was all you needed to keep going. If you were hungry, the tavern had food. Not good food, not safe food, just food. You might get a meat pie filled with something. Pork, maybe. Mutton, possibly. Rat, if the cook was having a bad week. Bread was available. hard as a weapon, and just as useful if things got rowdy. Sometimes there was cheese, which had been sitting out for an unknown amount of time and smelled like a personal attack. The food wasn't the point. The point was to absorb some of the alcohol so you didn't pass out face first into the fire. If it tasted bad, you just drank more to wash it down. Meat pies were the tavern's signature dish, and by signature I mean they were everywhere and universally suspicious. They were convenient, portable, self-contained, and required minimal effort to eat. You'd order one, and the tavern keeper would pull a crusty pastry from a pot near the fire, slap it on a wooden plate or directly into your hands, and that was dinner. The crust was thick and greasy, baked until it was nearly indestructible, useful for holding the filling in, less useful for digestion. What was inside? Great question. Officially it was meat. What kind of meat? The tavern keeper would tell you it was pork or mutton, but you had your doubts. The texture was inconsistent, sometimes chewy, sometimes gristly, occasionally crunchy in ways that made you stop chewing and reconsider your choices. The flavour was heavily seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were cheap and plentiful, mostly to mask the fact that the meat had been sitting around for longer than anyone would admit. You didn't ask questions, you just ate and hoped for the best. Some historians suggest that urban taverns occasionally use cat or rat meat when supplies ran low, especially during famines or harsh winters. It wasn't advertised, obviously, but when you're starving and someone offers you hot pie for a penny, you're not conducting a forensic analysis. You're eating. And honestly, after 4 mugs of ale, it all tasted the same anyway. Bread was the other staple, and calling it bread was generous. It was dense, coarse, and baked from the cheapest grain available, usually barley or rye, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch it further. The crust was hard enough to break teeth, and the inside was dry and crumbly. You'd tear off chunks and use them to soak up gravy or ale, or just gnaw on them until your jaw hurt. Stale bread was repurposed into trenchers, thick slices that served as edible plates. You'd pile your food on top, and by the end of the meal the bread had absorbed all the grease and juices. Some people ate the trencher, others left it for beggars or dogs. It depended on how hungry you were and how much you valued your digestive system. Cheese was available if you were brave. It sat on a wooden board near the kitchen, uncovered, exposed to flies, dust, and the general filth of the tavern. The smell was aggressive, sharp, sour, and faintly ammonia-like. The texture ranged from crumbly to disturbingly soft. Some cheeses were aged intentionally, others were just old. You'd cut a chunk, try not to inhale too deeply, and eat it with your bread. It was protein, it was calories, that was the extent of its appeal. Occasionally, taverns served pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and scraps were available. It simmered in a pot over the fire for hours, sometimes days, with new ingredients added as the old ones were ladled out. The result was a murky, indeterminate sludge that tasted vaguely of onions, turnips, and regret. But it was hot, it was filling, and it was cheap. You'd shovel it down with a wooden spoon, feel it settle heavily in your stomach, and know you wouldn't be hungry again for at least a few hours. The food wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep you upright long enough to finish your drinks and stumble home. It was fuel, not cuisine. And in a world where starvation was a real threat, even questionable meat pie felt like a small victory. There was no TV, no phones, no stand-up comedy specials. Entertainment in a medieval tavern was whatever you could make yourself. Someone might sing a bawdy song. Someone else might tell a story, probably exaggerated, about that one time they saw a dragon, or a knight, or a dragon-sized knight. Dice games and card games were popular, though they often ended in accusations of cheating and occasionally violence. But the real entertainment, watching other drunk people make terrible decisions. Someone would challenge someone else to an arm wrestling match, someone would try to impress a woman by juggling mugs, someone would start a fight over absolutely nothing. You just sat back, drank your ale, and enjoyed the show. Singing was the most common form of entertainment, and it was always loud, off-key, and deeply inappropriate. Medieval drinking songs weren't subtle, they were about sex, bodily functions, poking fun at the clergy or mocking nobles. Everyone knew the words, or at least the chorus, and you'd join in whether you could carry a tune or not. The point wasn't musical quality, the point was volume and enthusiasm. You'd stomp your feet, bang your mug on the table, and bellow along with a room full of strangers who were equally drunk and equally committed to ruining this song. It was cathartic, communal, and occasionally beautiful in its own chaotic way. Storytelling was another popular pastime, and the stories got wilder as the night went on. Someone would stand up, or stay seated if standing seemed risky, and start spinning a tale. Maybe they'd fought off bandits on the road, maybe they'd seen a ghost in the woods. Maybe they'd once met a man who claimed to have travelled to Jerusalem and fought a Saracen with his bare hands. The details were always suspicious. The timeline never quite added up. But nobody cared. You weren't listening for accuracy. You were listening because it was better than staring at the wall, and because the storyteller's confidence was entertaining enough on its own. Dice games were everywhere. Small, portable, and easy to learn, dice were the perfect tavern game. You'd gather around a table, place your bets, coins, food, whatever you had, and roll. The rules varied by region, but the outcome was always the same. Someone won, someone lost, and someone accused someone else of cheating. Loaded dice were common, and everyone knew it, but proving it was another matter. Arguments would erupt, voices would rise, and if you were unlucky, the game would end with overturned tables and flying fists. But until that moment, it was thrilling. The possibility of winning, the camaraderie of shared risk, the sheer stupidity of betting money you didn't have. It was gambling at its finest. Card games were less common, but just as chaotic. Cards were expensive, hard to come by, and often handmade. If a tavern had a deck, it was communal property, dogged and sticky from years of use. The games themselves were simple, matching, bluffing, trying to outsmart your opponent, while also trying to remember what cards had already been played through a haze of ale. Cheating was expected, winning was suspicious, and losing gracefully was unheard of. But the real entertainment, the stuff you couldn't plan or predict, was people. Drunk people doing drunk things. Someone would decide unprompted that they needed to prove their strength by arm wrestling the largest person in the room. The match would begin, everyone would gather around to watch, and it would either end in good-natured laughter or a dislocated shoulder. Someone else would try to impress a woman by demonstrating a skill they definitely didn't have, juggling mugs, doing a backflip, reciting poetry they'd just made up. It would fail spectacularly, and everyone would cheer anyway because the attempt was worth more than the result. And then there were the fights, random, sudden, and absurdly entertaining if you weren't involved. Someone would bump someone else. Words would be exchanged. A shove would follow. And suddenly 2 grown men were wrestling on the floor, knocking over benches and spilling drinks, while the rest of the tavern formed a circle and placed bets on who'd win. It was ridiculous, it was violent, and it was absolutely the highlight of the evening. Gambling was everywhere in medieval taverns, and it was a great way to turn a bad night into a catastrophic one. Dice were the most popular game, small, portable, and easy to rig. People bet coins, food, clothes, and occasionally things they didn't actually own. The games were loud, competitive, and almost always ended in an argument. Someone would accuse someone else of cheating, voices would rise, furniture would get shoved, and suddenly the friendly game of dice had turned into a full tavern brawl. But until that moment it was fun. Risky, stupid, completely irresponsible fun. Dice games were deceptively simple. You'd roll, you'd bet, you'd hope. The most common game was hazard, an ancestor of modern craps, where players would wager on the outcome of the roll. The rules were loose, interpreted differently in every tavern, which meant arguments about what counted as a win were baked into the experience. You'd sit around a table or huddle on the floor, clutching your coins, watching the dice tumble across scarred wood, and praying to whichever saint handled gambling luck. Spoiler, none of them did. Cheating was rampant. Loaded dice were easy to make. Just drill a tiny hole, fill it with lead, and suddenly your dice had a favourite number. Skilled players could palm dice, swap them mid-game, or use sleight of hand to manipulate the outcome. Everyone knew this. Everyone suspected everyone else. But proving it was nearly impossible, especially when you were 3 mugs deep and your vision was getting blurry. So instead of proof, you'd rely on volume. You'd shout accusations, demand to inspect the dice, and when that didn't work, you'd flip the table and let chaos decide the winner. The stakes escalated quickly. It would start innocently. A penny here, a half-penny there. Then someone would bet their dinner, then their cloak. Then, in a moment of drunken confidence, they'd bet something they didn't actually have. A cow they co-owned with their brother, next month's wages, their wife's dowry. The logic was flawless in the moment. They were definitely going to win, so it didn't matter. Except they didn't win. They never won. And now they had to explain to their wife why her grandmother's silver brooch was gone. Women gambled too, though less openly. Some taverns frowned on it, considering it unladylike or morally suspect. But plenty of women, especially alewives, servants, and women who'd stopped caring about propriety years ago, would join the games or run their own in corners of the tavern. They were just as competitive, just as willing to cheat, and just as likely to start a fight when things went south. Gender equality, medieval style. The church officially condemned gambling. Priests preached against it, calling it sinful, a waste of God-given resources, and a gateway to violence and despair. They weren't wrong. Gambling ruined lives. Men lost everything, money, possessions, respect, in a single unlucky night. Families went hungry because their breadwinner had bet the week's earnings on a roll of the dice, but the church's condemnation didn't stop anyone. If anything, it made gambling feel slightly more rebellious, which only added to the appeal. When the accusations of cheating finally flew, the game would implode. Someone would grab the dice, claim they were weighted and demand their money back. The accused would deny everything, insult the accuser's mother, and refuse to return a single coin. Voices would rise, friends would take sides, and within seconds, what had been a friendly wager turned into a shoving match. Mugs would get knocked over, benches would screech across the floor, and the tavern keeper would appear, club in hand, ready to bash heads if it meant protecting the furniture. But here's the thing, no one learned. The next night the same people would gather around the same table, pull out the same dice and do it all over again. Because gambling wasn't really about winning. It was about hope. The hope that tonight, just maybe, luck would be on your side, that you'd walk away richer, prouder, vindicated, and when that didn't happen, when you stumbled home broke, bruised and wondering why you ever thought betting your shoes was a good idea, you'd tell yourself next time would be different. It never was. Medieval taverns were also places where people tried, often badly, to find companionship. Maybe it was a farmer trying to charm a milkmaid. Maybe it was a travelling merchant sweet-talking the tavern keeper's daughter. Maybe it was two drunk people, realising they both hated their lives and deciding to make poor choices together. The lighting was terrible, everyone smelled, standards were low, but after enough ale everyone looked a little better. And if things went well, you might end up sneaking off to a corner or behind the building. If things went poorly, you'd get rejected in front of everyone and have to sit there pretending it didn't hurt. Flirting in a medieval tavern was an art form, and by art form I mean it was clumsy, desperate, and rarely successful. You'd spot someone across the room, someone who, in the dim candlelight and through your ale-induced haze, looked attractive enough. You'd make eye contact. Maybe they'd smile. Maybe they'd look away. Either way, you were committed now. You'd saunter over, trying to look confident despite the fact that you'd just tripped over a sleeping dog, and deliver your best opening line, which was probably something like, "You come here often?" Originality wasn't the goal. Not passing out mid-sentence was. Compliments were straightforward and not particularly poetic. You'd tell someone they had nice teeth, if they had any, or nice hair, if it wasn't covered in a cap, or that they smelled better than most people, which was a genuine compliment in the 14th century. The bar for flattery was on the floor, and yet people still managed to mess it up. You'd say something you thought was charming, they'd look at you like you'd just insulted their livestock, and suddenly you were retreating back to your bench wondering what went wrong. Physical attractiveness was subjective and heavily influenced by alcohol consumption. After one mug, someone might seem mildly interesting. After 3, they were suddenly the most captivating person you'd ever met. After 5, you were convinced this was destiny. The lighting helped, or rather, the lack of it. In the smoky, dim interior of a tavern, everyone's flaws were softened. That missing tooth, barely noticeable. That questionable rash, probably just shadows. Your brain filled in the gaps with optimism, and your judgment went on vacation. If your flirting was successful, the next step was finding privacy, which in a crowded medieval tavern was nearly impossible. You couldn't exactly rent a room. Those were expensive and often already occupied by travellers. So you'd get creative. A dark corner near the back, the space behind the ale barrels. Outside, against the tavern wall, hoping no one stumbled out to relieve themselves in the same spot. Romance was where you found it. and where you found it was usually dirty, uncomfortable, and briefly interrupted by someone's confused chicken. But rejection was far more common than success, and it was brutal. You'd make your move, deliver your line, and they'd laugh. Not with you, at you. Or worse, they'd just stare blankly and say, no. One word, devastating. And because this was happening in a public space filled with people who had nothing better to do than watch, everyone saw it. Your friends would mock you, strangers would snicker, and you'd have to sit back down, pretend you didn't care, and focus very hard on your ale while your face burned with humiliation. Women dealt with their own challenges. Flirting back could be fun, but it could also be dangerous. A man who was charming after 2 mugs could turn aggressive after 4, and if you rejected someone, you risked anger, insults, or worse. Women in taverns had to navigate a careful balance, friendly enough to avoid conflict, distant enough to avoid unwanted attention. It was exhausting, and it meant that most women who worked in or frequented taverns developed very thick skin and very sharp tongues. Some taverns had reputations as places where companionship could be purchased. Prostitution was illegal but widespread, and taverns were known gathering spots. Some women worked independently. Others were employed by the tavern keeper, which added a whole layer of moral and legal complication. The church condemned it, the law punished it, and yet it thrived because, as with most things in medieval life, desperation and demand created their own economy. For most people, though, tavern romance was less about love and more about connection. A brief moment where someone saw you, talked to you, maybe even liked you. In a world that was lonely, brutal, and short, that was enough. Even if it only lasted until morning, fights in medieval taverns weren't rare. They were expected. You'd be sitting there, minding your business, and suddenly someone would throw a punch because someone else looked at them wrong, or bumped their elbow, or existed near them in an annoying way. Tables got flipped, mugs got thrown, people got shoved into walls, and everyone else just moved their drinks and kept watching. Unless you were directly involved, you stayed out of it. The fight would end when someone got tired, someone got knocked out, or the tavern keeper showed up with a club and some very strong opinions about property damage. The triggers for tavern fights were absurdly minor. Someone would accuse someone else of cheating at dice, probably correctly. Someone would make an offhand comment about another man's wife, mother, or pig. Someone would reach for the last piece of bread. Or someone would just be having a bad day and decided that violence was the answer. Alcohol didn't cause these fights so much as remove the thin layer of self-control that normally kept people from acting on their worst impulses. Sober, you'd let it go. Drunk, you'd swing. The fights themselves were chaotic and uncoordinated. These weren't trained warriors. They were exhausted peasants and tipsy craftsmen who spent their days ploughing fields or hammering nails, not practicing combat. Punches were wild and often missed. Grappling was more common. 2 men would grab each other and tumble to the ground in a mess of flailing limbs and creative cursing. Occasionally someone would grab a weapon, a knife from their belt, a wooden stool, a conveniently placed fire poker. Things escalated quickly. Bystanders had a system. The moment a fight broke out, you'd grab your mug, slide it out of harm's way, and shuffle your bench back a few inches. Then you'd settle in to watch. This was free entertainment, and you'd paid good money to be here. You'd cheer for your favourite, place informal bets on who'd win, and offer running commentary. He's got him now. Watch the left. Someone's losing a tooth. It was like medieval pay-per-view, except nobody paid extra and everyone got splattered with beer. But you didn't intervene. Getting involved in someone else's fight was a great way to get punched by both parties. Plus, medieval honour codes were weird and unpredictable. If you helped someone, they might be grateful, or they might be insulted that you thought they needed help and turn on you instead. So you stayed seated, stayed quiet, and let the chaos unfold. The fights usually ended in one of 3 ways. First, someone would get tired. Medieval people were malnourished, overworked, and not exactly in peak physical condition. After a minute or 2 of wrestling, both fighters would be gasping for air, ready to call it a draw and go back to drinking. Second, someone would get knocked out, either from a lucky punch or from cracking their head on a table. Everyone would go quiet for a moment, check if the person was still breathing, then shrug and continue their evening. Third, the tavern keeper would appear, having finally had enough. They'd storm over with a wooden club, a broom, or their bare hands, and physically separate the fighters. Then they'd demand payment for any broken furniture, threaten to ban them both, and kick them outside to finish it in the street. Injuries were common: black eyes, split lips, broken noses, all standard outcomes. Occasionally someone would break a rib or dislocate a shoulder. Rarely, someone would pull a knife and things would turn deadly. When that happened, the mood shifted. The tavern would go silent. The wounded man would be dragged outside, either to recover or to die quietly where he wouldn't stain the floor. And the person who'd stabbed him would either flee into the night or sit there staring at his hands, realizing he'd just made a catastrophic mistake. But most of the time, fights were just part of the atmosphere. Like the smoke, the smell, and the questionable food, violence was woven into the tavern experience. You accepted it, avoided it when possible, and enjoyed the show when it didn't involve you. Because in a world where life was brutal and short, watching two drunk men wrestle over an insult was just another Tuesday night. Medieval taverns were hotbeds of illegal activity. Stolen goods were bought and sold in shadowy corners. Criminals hid out in rented rooms upstairs. People made deals they'd later regret. And murders, they happened. Not constantly, but often enough that he was stabbed in a tavern was a perfectly normal cause of death. The authorities knew this. They raided taverns regularly, looking for fugitives, contraband, or just people who owed taxes. If you were smart, you kept your head down, didn't ask questions, and definitely didn't volunteer information to anyone in uniform. Taverns were the perfect cover for illegal transactions. They were loud, crowded, and full of strangers who minded their own business. If you needed to sell a found cow, buy a suspiciously nice silver cup, or hire someone to rough up your neighbour, the tavern was where you went. Deals were made over ale, sealed with handshakes, and never written down. If something went wrong, there was no proof, no paper trail, just conflicting stories told to authorities who didn't particularly care. Stolen goods moved through taverns like water through a sieve. Someone would walk in with a bundle under their arm, sidle up to a known fence, and quietly negotiate a price. The goods would disappear into a back room or under a cloak, coins would change hands, and both parties would go back to drinking like nothing happened. The tavern keeper saw everything and nothing. They weren't stupid, they knew what was happening. But as long as it didn't cause trouble or attract the law, they looked the other way. Business was business. Fugitives used taverns as temporary hideouts. If you were on the run, whether from the law, your lord, or an angry spouse, a tavern with rooms upstairs was a decent place to lay low. You'd rent a space, stay quiet, and hope nobody recognized you. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a bailiff would kick the door in at dawn, drag you out in your underclothes, and haul you off to face justice. Medieval witness protection didn't exist. You were either lucky or caught. Murders in taverns were disturbingly common. Coroners' records from medieval England are full of them. John the Baker stabbed in a tavern dispute. William the Tanner beaten to death over a gambling debt. Most of these weren't premeditated. They were the result of bad luck, too much ale, and a weapon within reach. A fight would escalate, someone would draw a knife, and suddenly what had been a shouting match turned fatal. The killer would flee, the body would be dragged outside, and the tavern keeper would spend the next week explaining to authorities why this kept happening in their establishment. The law's relationship with taverns was complicated. On one hand, authorities needed them. Taverns were where they'd go to gather information, recruit soldiers, or intercept criminals. On the other hand, taverns were sources of chaos and moral decay. Local officials would conduct raids, storming in with armed men, overturning tables, and demanding to see everyone's identification, or medieval equivalent thereof. They'd arrest anyone who looked suspicious, confiscate contraband, and issue fines to the tavern keeper for running a disorderly house. Tavern keepers walked a legal tightrope. They had to follow regulations, proper licenses, quality control, fair pricing, while also keeping the law off their back about the criminal activity happening under their roof. If a fugitive was found hiding upstairs, the keeper could be fined or accused of harbouring criminals. If a murder happened on the premises, they'd be questioned extensively and possibly held responsible if they'd served the killer too much ale. It was a lose-lose situation. And then there were the taxes. Tavern keepers paid taxes on their ale production, their building, and sometimes even on the number of customers they served. Tax collectors were relentless, and they knew taverns handled cash. If you fell behind on payments, they'd show up with muscle, seize your barrels, and shut you down. The threat of financial ruin was constant, and it meant most tavern keepers operated in a grey area between legal compliance and survival. For patrons, the message was clear: see nothing, say nothing, and definitely don't get involved. If authorities questioned you about a crime, you suddenly had the memory of a goldfish. You didn't see who stabbed that man. You didn't notice the stolen horse being sold by the bar. You were just there for the ale. Snitching was dangerous. Criminals had long memories and short tempers, so you kept quiet, finished your drink and went home, grateful you weren't the one being dragged away in chains. Women in medieval taverns held a complicated position. Many taverns were run by women, alewives who brewed the beer, served the drinks, and kept the chaos under control. They were tough, sharp-tongued, and took absolutely zero nonsense from drunk men. But they were also vulnerable. Taverns had a reputation, and women who worked there were often accused of being immoral, whether they were or not. Some taverns doubled as brothels, others didn't, but people assumed they did anyway. Women navigated this world with grit and strategy, knowing that one wrong move could ruin their reputation, or worse. Alewives were the backbone of the medieval drinking economy. Brewing ale was traditionally women's work, done at home alongside cooking, cleaning and raising children. When a woman brewed a particularly good batch, she'd hang a sign outside, usually an ale stake, a pole with a bush or bundle of straw attached, to let neighbours know she had ale for sale. Her home would temporarily become a tavern. People would crowd into her kitchen, drink from her barrels and pay her directly. It was one of the few ways women could earn independent income, and many took it seriously. Running a tavern required physical strength, mental sharpness, and an ability to manage drunk men twice your size. Alewives hauled heavy barrels, tended fires, broke up fights, and kept tabs on who owed what. They needed to be assertive without being aggressive, friendly without being flirtatious, and firm enough to throw someone out when necessary. It was exhausting, dangerous, and often thankless work. But it was also power. In a world where women had limited economic autonomy, running a tavern meant controlling your own income and to some extent your own life, but that power came with a cost. Women who ran or worked in taverns were constantly under scrutiny. The church preached that taverns were dens of sin, and by extension, the women associated with them were morally suspect. Alewives were accused of watering down ale, overcharging customers, and using their sexuality to manipulate men. Some of these accusations were true. Watering down ale was common, though men did it too. But most were rooted in misogyny, and the assumption that any woman in a public male-dominated space must be up to no good. The stereotype of the promiscuous tavern wench was pervasive and damaging. Some taverns did operate as brothels, where women worked serving drinks and offering other services, but many didn't, and the women who worked there resented being lumped in with sex workers. Still, the assumption persisted. A woman serving ale was automatically assumed to be available, whether she was or not. She'd deal with unwanted advances, crude jokes, and men who thought buying a drink entitled them to something more. Saying no could result in insults, threats, or violence. Saying yes meant confirming every stereotype. It was a trap with no good exit. Women who frequented taverns as customers faced similar judgment. Respectable women, wives, daughters of merchants or craftsmen, were discouraged from entering taverns alone. It wasn't considered proper. If a woman did go, she'd usually be accompanied by her husband or family members. A woman drinking alone was seen as either desperate or dangerous, someone who'd abandoned social norms and was therefore fair game for harassment. But not all women cared about propriety. Widows, lower-class women, and those who'd already lost their reputations had more freedom to move through tavern culture. They'd drink, gamble, and fight alongside men, carving out space in a world that didn't particularly want them there. They developed thick skins, quick wits, and the ability to defend themselves verbally and, when necessary, physically. These women didn't wait for protection. They created their own. The legal system offered little help. If a woman was assaulted in a tavern, authorities were more likely to blame her for being there in the first place than to punish her attacker. If she ran a tavern and a crime occurred, she could be held responsible. If she brewed bad ale, she'd be fined or publicly humiliated. The rules were designed to keep women in check, to remind them that even when they held economic power, society still saw them as secondary, suspect, and expendable. And yet women persisted. They brewed, they served, they survived. They built businesses, supported families, and navigated a world that was hostile to their existence. They weren't celebrated, they weren't protected. But they were there, in every tavern, keeping the ale flowing and the chaos manageable, one sharp remark and one heavy barrel at a time. If you caused too much trouble, you got kicked out. It wasn't a polite request. The tavern keeper or a particularly large patron would grab you by the collar, drag you to the door and physically throw you into the street. You'd land in the mud, or worse, and the door would slam behind you. Everyone inside would laugh. You'd stagger to your feet, dignity shattered, and wander off into the night. Getting kicked out of a tavern was embarrassing, but also kind of a rite of passage. If it hadn't happened to you yet, you probably weren't drinking hard enough. The reasons for getting kicked out varied, but they all boiled down to being more trouble than you were worth. Maybe you started a fight and wouldn't stop. Maybe you broke furniture, a bench, a table, someone's nose. Maybe you insulted the tavern keeper's wife, which was a fast track to the door and possibly a beating. Maybe you couldn't pay your tab and had the audacity to argue about it. Or maybe you just got too drunk, became incoherent and started bothering other customers. Whatever the reason, your time was up. The ejection process was not gentle. The tavern keeper would approach with a kind of calm that meant violence was imminent. They'd grab you, usually by the back of your tunic or your arm, and start dragging. You might protest, you might try to resist. It didn't matter. They'd been doing this for years, and you were drunk, uncoordinated and significantly weaker than you thought. If you were particularly uncooperative, another patron would help. Not out of duty to the tavern keeper, but because watching someone get thrown out was entertaining, and participating made it even better. You'd be hauled toward the door, stumbling, knocking into tables, maybe grabbing at benches to slow your departure. It never worked. The door would swing open, or get kicked open, and suddenly you were airborne. For a brief weightless moment you'd fly. Then gravity would remember you existed, and you'd hit the ground hard. If you were lucky, it was mud. Soft, squishy, disgusting mud that cushioned your fall and soaked through your clothes. If you were unlucky, it was cobblestones, or a pile of garbage. Or the spot where everyone had been relieving themselves for the past 6 hours. The door would slam. Laughter would erupt inside, and you'd lie there for a moment, stunned, wondering how your evening had gone so wrong. Your ears would ring, your pride would be in tatters, and slowly you'd push yourself upright, mud dripping from your hair, your clothes ruined, your dignity a distant memory. You'd glance back at the tavern door, briefly consider trying to get back in, then think better of it. The tavern keeper had made their position clear. You were done. Walking away was its own humiliation. If the tavern was in town, people saw you. Neighbours, strangers, possibly someone you owed money to. They'd smirk, whisper, and the story would spread. By morning, everyone would know you got thrown out of the tavern. Again, your reputation, already questionable, would take another hit. But reputation was a luxury in medieval life, and most people had already lost theirs years ago. Some people took getting kicked out in stride. It was a badge of honour, proof that you'd lived hard and cared little for consequences. You'd laugh it off, dust yourself off, well, scrape the mud off, and head home or to another tavern if you still had coins. Others took it personally. They'd lurk outside, muttering threats, plotting revenge they'd never actually carry out. A few would try to sneak back in later, disguised or apologetic, hoping the tavern keeper had forgotten. They hadn't. Tavern keepers had excellent memories, especially for troublemakers, and occasionally getting kicked out was a blessing in disguise. Maybe you were too drunk to walk home safely. And maybe you were about to say something that would get you stabbed. Maybe the tavern was about to be raided by authorities, and now you were conveniently elsewhere. You'd never admit it, but sometimes being thrown into the mud was the best thing that could have happened. Still, as you staggered down the dark street, alone, cold, and covered in filth, it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like exactly what it was, the ultimate medieval walk of shame. And tomorrow, you'd do it all over again. If you were too drunk to make it home, you could rent a room upstairs. And by room, I mean a space barely big enough to lie down in, with a straw mattress that smelled like everyone who'd ever slept there. You'd share the room with strangers, maybe 3 or 4 other people, all crammed in together, snoring, farting, and occasionally stealing each other's belongings. Privacy didn't exist, The bed had fleas, the walls were thin, and if you were really unlucky, someone in the next room was having a very loud night. But at least you weren't walking home in the dark, where robbers, wolves, and your own bad decisions were waiting. The decision to stay overnight was usually made for you by your legs, which had stopped cooperating around your sixth mug. You'd stumble to the tavern keeper, slur something about needing a bed, and hand over a few coins. They'd point to a narrow staircase in the corner, often more ladder than stairs, and up you'd go. Each step was a negotiation between gravity and willpower. You'd grip the railing, if there was one, and haul yourself upward, trying not to think about how far you'd fall if you slipped. The upper floor was a maze of tiny rooms, barely separated by thin wooden walls or hanging cloths. You'd be directed to your space, which was less a private room and more a section of floor with a mattress on it. The mattress was a loose term for a sack stuffed with straw, reeds, or whatever organic material had been available when it was made. It was lumpy, flattened from use, and smelled like a combination of sweat, mildew, and things you didn't want to identify. You'd lower yourself onto it and immediately feel something move beneath you, the straw shifting, or the fleas waking up. Hard to say. Sharing the room was mandatory. Space was expensive, and tavern keepers maximised profit by cramming as many bodies as possible into each area. You'd be lying there, trying to get comfortable, when someone else would stumble in. A merchant, a labourer, maybe a pilgrim who'd taken a wrong turn. They'd collapse onto their own mattress, or yours if they were drunk enough to miss. You'd shift over, muttering complaints neither of you could hear over the noise downstairs, and resign yourself to a night of unwanted companionship. Snoring was inevitable. At least one person would snore like a dying boar, a deep rattling sound that echoed off the walls and made sleep nearly impossible. You'd try covering your ears with your cloak, you'd try rolling over. Nothing worked. Eventually you'd either fall asleep out of sheer exhaustion or lie there seething, mentally composing the complaint you'd never actually voice because confronting a snoring stranger in the dark was a terrible idea. The fleas were the worst part. Medieval fleas were aggressive, numerous, and completely undeterred by human suffering. They'd bite you all night, your arms, legs, scalp, places you didn't know fleas could reach. You'd scratch in your sleep, wake up scratching, and spend the next day scratching. Some bites would swell into angry red welts, others would get infected. But complaining about fleas in a medieval inn was like complaining about rain in England. Everyone had them. It was just part of life. Theft was a genuine risk. You'd fall asleep with your coin pouch tucked under your body, only to wake up and find it lighter, or gone entirely. Your cloak might disappear. Your shoes, if you'd been foolish enough to take them off, would vanish. The other occupants of the room would feign sleep, and you'd have no proof, no recourse, and no choice but to chalk it up as a lesson learned. Next time, you'd sleep with your belongings tied to your body, or not sleep at all. The walls were thin enough that you could hear everything happening in adjacent rooms. Conversations, arguments, romantic encounters that were neither romantic nor consensual sounding, and the occasional violent dispute that made you grateful you'd locked your door, if your room even had a lock. You'd lie there, listening to the symphony of medieval inn life, and wonder if going home drunk through the dark streets might have been the safer option after all. But when morning finally came, grey light filtering through cracks in the walls, you'd peel yourself off the mattress, assess the damage, new bites, missing coins, a headache that could kill a horse, and head back downstairs. You'd survived the night. That alone was worth celebrating, or at least worth another drink. Waking up after a night in a medieval tavern was brutal. Your head pounded, your mouth tasted like something died in it. Your body ached from sleeping on straw or possibly the floor. You checked your pockets and realised you'd spent way more money than you intended, or someone had robbed you. Hard to say. You stumbled outside into the blinding daylight, squinting like a mole, and tried to piece together what happened. Did you start a fight? Did you win? Did you make a bet you couldn't afford? The answers were hazy, but the consequences were very real, and now you had to go back to work. The headache was immediate and merciless. It started behind your eyes and radiated outward like someone was driving a nail through your skull. Medieval ale didn't cause hangovers quite like modern alcohol. It was weaker, less refined, and your body was somewhat used to constant low-grade intoxication. But drink enough of it, especially the strong stuff, and you'd wake up feeling like you'd been kicked by a horse. There was no aspirin, no ibuprofen, no greasy breakfast to absorb the damage. Just pain, regret, and the vague hope that movement wouldn't make it worse. Spoiler, movement made it worse. Your mouth felt like it had been stuffed with wool and left in the sun. Dry, fuzzy, tasting of stale ale, old bread, and possibly someone else's bad decisions. You desperately needed water, but water was risky. So you'd probably drink more small beer, hair of the dog, medieval style. It didn't cure the hangover, but it numbed the edges enough to make standing upright slightly more tolerable. Your body was a disaster. If you'd slept on a straw mattress, your back was stiff and your skin covered in tiny scratches from the straw poking through the fabric. If you'd passed out on the floor, you had bruises in places you didn't know could bruise. Your joints ached. Your neck was crooked from sleeping at an unnatural angle. And the flea bites. Oh, the flea bites. They itched ferociously. Little red welts clustered on your arms, legs and torso. Scratching them felt good for about 2 seconds, then made everything worse. Then came the financial reckoning. You'd pat your pockets and realise with sinking dread that your coin pouch was lighter than it should be. You'd try to remember how much you'd spent. 1 mug, 2, 5. Did you buy a round for strangers? Did you bet money on dice? Did you pay for food you didn't eat? The memories were murky, fragmented, unhelpful. And if your pouch was completely empty, you had to face the possibility that someone had robbed you while you slept. Or maybe you'd just been that generous. Either way, the money was gone, and so was your ability to eat for the next few days. You'd step outside and the daylight would assault you like a personal enemy. The sun, which you normally tolerated, was now unbearably bright. You'd squint, shield your eyes, and shuffle forward like a reanimated corpse. People would stare, not with sympathy, with judgment. Everyone knew what a tavern hangover looked like, and they knew you'd done this to yourself. As you walked, fragments of the previous night would start coming back. A conversation that seemed hilarious at the time but now made no sense. A woman you'd tried to impress who'd laughed at you. A man you'd insulted for reasons you couldn't remember. Had you thrown a punch? Had someone thrown one at you? You'd check your knuckles, bruised, your lip split. Great. You'd definitely been in a fight. Whether you won or lost was anyone's guess, but based on how you felt, probably lost. And then the worst realization hit. You had to work today. There was no calling in sick, no duvet day, no excuses. Your lord, your employer, or your own survival instinct demanded that you show up and perform manual labour for the next 10 to 12 hours. With a splitting headache, on no sleep, possibly still drunk, you'd trudge toward the fields, the workshop, or wherever your particular form of suffering took place, and you'd make yourself a promise, never again. You wouldn't drink like that again. You'd be responsible, sensible. You'd save your money and your dignity. And then, that night, after another brutal day of work, you'd find yourself back at the tavern. Because what else was there? The cycle continued. The hangover was temporary. The need to forget was permanent. Drinking in medieval taverns could actually kill you. Not just from the alcohol, though alcohol poisoning was definitely a thing, but from everything around it. People drowned in ale vats while checking the fermentation. Others choked on their own vomit after drinking too much. Some got into fights and didn't survive. And then there were the accidents. Tripping into the fire, falling downstairs, wandering into the street and getting trampled by a horse. The coroner's records from medieval England are full of tavern-related deaths. Each one a reminder that having a good time in the Middle Ages was genuinely dangerous. Let's start with the drowning incidents, which sound absurd until you realise they happened with disturbing regularity. Brewers would lean over large vats to check the fermentation, taste the batch, or retrieve something that had fallen in. The vats were deep, wide, and filled with fermenting liquid that gave off carbon dioxide. If you leaned too far, you'd lose your balance and tip forward. The liquid was thick enough to make swimming difficult, and if you'd already been drinking, which most brewers had, your coordination was shot. You'd thrash, panic, and sink. Your co-workers might find you hours later, face down in the very product you'd spent weeks perfecting. It was tragic, ironic, and a surprisingly common way to go. Choking deaths were frequent. After a night of heavy drinking, you'd pass out wherever you happened to be, on a bench, on the floor, sometimes face down. If you vomited in your sleep, which drunk people often did, you could easily choke. No one would notice until morning, and by then it was too late. Coroner's reports describe these deaths with clinical detachment. Found dead in the tavern, choked on his own vomit. No drama, no sympathy, just another body to haul away. Fires were a constant threat. Taverns were lit by open flames, candles, oil lamps, and the central hearth. Drunk people and fire are a terrible combination. You'd stumble, lose your balance, and fall directly into the hearth. Your clothes, soaked in ale and months of grime, would catch fire instantly. If you were lucky, someone would douse you with whatever liquid was nearby. If not, you'd burn. Some people died immediately. Others lingered for days with horrific burns, infections setting in, medieval medicine utterly useless. Staircase deaths were tragically common. The stairs in medieval taverns were narrow, steep, and poorly lit. Sober, they were challenging. Drunk, they were death traps. You'd miss a step, tumble forward, and crack your skull on the way down, or you'd trip going up, fall backward, and break your neck. Coroners recorded dozens of these incidents, often with frustratingly little detail. Fell downstairs, dead. That was it. No investigation, no safety improvements. Just an acknowledgement that stairs and ale didn't mix. Street accidents claimed plenty of victims too. You'd leave the tavern, drunk and disoriented, and wander into the road at exactly the wrong moment. A horse-drawn cart would barrel through, the driver unable to stop in time, and you'd be trampled or run over. Medieval streets weren't well lit. There were no streetlights, no reflective clothing, no designated crossings. Just darkness, drunk pedestrians, and moving vehicles with zero safety features. It was a miracle anyone survived. Then there were the murders, which we've covered, but they're worth mentioning again because they were distressingly routine. Tavern disputes turned deadly with shocking speed. A punch, a shove, a knife drawn in anger. Suddenly someone was bleeding out on the floor, and the killer was fleeing into the night. The victim's family would be left to bury them, and wonder if revenge was worth the risk. Alcohol poisoning in the modern sense was less common because medieval ale was relatively weak, but strong ale or spirits, when available, could absolutely kill you if you drank enough. You'd keep drinking, feeling invincible, until suddenly you weren't. You'd collapse, your body unable to process the toxins, and slip into unconsciousness. Sometimes you'd wake up with the worst hangover of your life. Sometimes you just wouldn't wake up. Even indirect deaths were linked to taverns. You'd spend all your money on ale, leaving nothing for food. Malnutrition would set in. Your immune system would weaken. A minor illness would become fatal. Or you'd drink so much over the years that your liver gave out. Though medieval people didn't understand organ failure, they just knew you'd turned yellow, stopped eating, and died. The coroner's rolls paint a grim picture. Every week another tavern death, another preventable tragedy, and yet people kept drinking. Because the alternative, facing medieval life completely sober, was somehow worse. Medieval drinking songs were not subtle. They were raunchy, repetitive, and designed to be shouted by a room full of drunk people who couldn't carry a tune. Songs about sex, songs about fighting, songs mocking the clergy or the nobility. Everyone knew the words, or at least pretended to. You'd stomp your feet, bang your mug on the table, and bellow along with everyone else. The songs weren't beautiful, they were cathartic. A way to laugh at the absurdity of life, to bond with strangers, and to feel, for just a moment, like you were part of something. Even if that something was just a mob of drunk peasants yelling about a miller's daughter. The lyrics were gloriously inappropriate. Songs about lusty maidens, incompetent priests, cuckolded husbands, and bodily functions that polite society pretended didn't exist. One popular song involved a monk who couldn't keep his vows. Another detailed the romantic misadventures of a travelling merchant. A third was just an extended joke about farting. Subtlety was not the goal. The goal was to make everyone laugh, to say things out loud that you'd never say sober, and to create a shared moment of joyful vulgarity. The melodies were simple, repetitive, and designed for group participation. You didn't need musical training, you just needed lungs and a willingness to be loud. The verses would be sung by someone who vaguely remembered the words, and everyone else would join in on the chorus, shouting it with enough enthusiasm to shake the rafters. Accuracy didn't matter. Half the people were slurring, the other half were making up their own lyrics. But somehow, it all came together into a glorious, chaotic wall of sound. Rhythm was provided by whatever was available. Mugs banged on tables, feet stomped on the floor, hands clapped. Someone might have a drum or a simple wooden flute, but more often the percussion was just drunk people hitting things. The louder, the better. The whole tavern would pulse with the beat, and you'd feel it in your chest, in your bones, a primal reminder that you were alive and part of a community, even if that community was temporary and fueled by fermented grain. Some songs had regional variations. A tune popular in one village might have completely different words in the next town over. Travelling merchants and soldiers would bring new verses, and locals would adapt them to fit their own circumstances. The song about the bishop who got drunk and fell off his horse? In your village, it was about your local lord. The one about the baker's wife? In your town, she had a different, even more scandalous backstory. The songs evolved, mutated, and spread like particularly catchy diseases. Religious songs occasionally made appearances, but they were usually parodies. Someone would take a well-known hymn and replace the holy lyrics with something profane. It was blasphemous, definitely frowned upon by the church, and absolutely hilarious to a room full of people who spent their Sundays being lectured about sin. Mocking the clergy was a favourite pastime. Songs about gluttonous monks, lecherous priests, and hypocritical bishops were endlessly popular because everyone had experience with religious figures who preached virtue and practiced vice. The songs also served as social commentary. In a world where openly criticising the nobility could get you flogged or worse, tavern songs provided a safe outlet. You could sing about the unfair taxes, the cruel lord, the corrupt bailiff, and as long as you were drunk and surrounded by fellow peasants, nobody would report you. The songs were rebellion in miniature, a way to voice frustration without facing consequences, at least not immediate ones. Women participated too, though their songs were often slightly different in tone, less about conquest, more about wit and survival. Songs mocking foolish men, celebrating clever women, or poking fun at marriage. When a woman led a song, the room would quiet slightly listening, because female voices in taverns commanded a different kind of attention. Respect, curiosity, or occasionally hostility depending on the crowd. By the end of the night, everyone had sung everything at least twice. Your voice was hoarse, your throat hurt, your ears rang. But you'd remember the songs, you'd hum them in the fields the next day, teach them to your children, and bring them back to the tavern the following week. Because tavern songs weren't just entertainment, they were memory, culture, and connection. They were proof that even in the darkest, hardest times, people could still open their mouths and shout something joyful into the void. The church had opinions about taverns. Officially, they were dens of sin, places where people drank too much, gambled, fought, and committed various moral infractions. Priests gave sermons warning against the evils of excessive drinking, but unofficially, monks and clergy were some of the tavern's best customers. Monasteries brewed their own beer, often the best in the region, and monks were known to enjoy it liberally. Some clergy ran taverns as side businesses. The hypocrisy was staggering, but also very medieval. Rules for thee, ale for me. The church's official stance was clear. Taverns were dangerous to the soul. They were places where men wasted money their families needed, where violence erupted over nothing, where lust and gluttony thrived. Priests would stand in their pulpits on Sunday morning and rail against the evils of drink, urging their congregations to avoid temptation and live virtuously. They describe in vivid detail how the devil lurked in every mug, waiting to drag sinners down to hell. The message was unambiguous: stay away from taverns or risk eternal damnation. And then, Sunday afternoon, those same priests would quietly slip into the local tavern for a drink. Not all of them, of course. Some genuinely practiced what they preached, but enough that it was noticed, commented on, and mocked in tavern songs. The clergy were human, after all, with the same needs and weaknesses as everyone else. And after delivering a fire and brimstone sermon, a man might feel he'd earned a mug or two. Monks were the true champions of medieval drinking. Monasteries weren't just centres of prayer and learning, they were breweries. Monks brewed ale and beer as part of their daily routine, both for their own consumption and for sale to support the monastery, and they were good at it. Monastic brewers had time, resources, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Their beer was often the highest quality available, carefully crafted, consistently brewed, and sought after by nobles and commoners alike. Monks also had generous ale allowances. In some monasteries, each monk was allotted up to a gallon of ale per day. That's roughly 8 pints, every single day. The justification was theological. Ale was liquid bread, a necessary form of sustenance, especially during fasting periods when solid food was restricted. But the result was a religious community of men who were mildly buzzed most of the time, quietly going about their prayers and chores with a pleasant warmth in their bellies. Some monasteries even operated their own taverns, either on monastery grounds or in nearby towns. These establishments served travellers, pilgrims and locals, providing food, drink and lodging. The profits funded the monastery's charitable work, building projects and general upkeep. So technically, when you drank at a church-run tavern, you were supporting holy work. At least that's what the monks would tell you as they poured your third mug. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on medieval people. They joked about it, sang about it, and occasionally threw it back in the clergy's faces when accused of sin. "You're lecturing me about gluttony, Father, and I saw you at the tavern last week with gravy on your robe." It didn't change anything. The church still held enormous power, and criticising clergy too openly was risky. But it created a kind of understanding. The rules were more like guidelines, and everyone, even the holiest among them, bent the guidelines when convenient. Taverns near churches were particularly popular because they provided a convenient stop after Mass. You'd fulfill your religious obligation, then head next door to wash it down with ale. Some tavern keepers even timed their business around church services, knowing that a fresh crowd of thirsty parishioners would arrive as soon as the priest finished his benediction. It was symbiotic. The church saved souls, the tavern soothed them. There were occasional crackdowns. Reformist bishops would issue decrees banning clergy from frequenting taverns or running them. Monks would be reprimanded for excessive drinking. Tavern keepers near churches would be fined for encouraging post-mass debauchery. But these efforts were sporadic and rarely effective. The culture was too deeply entrenched. Drinking was woven into the fabric of medieval life, and the church, for all its moralizing, was part of that fabric. So the dance continued. Priests preached. Monks brewed. Lay people drank, and everyone understood that the rules were less about absolute morality and more about maintaining appearances. As long as you showed up to Mass, confessed your sins occasionally, and didn't drink yourself to death in a particularly public way, the church would look the other way. After all, they had their own mugs to fill. Medieval taverns weren't just places to drink. They were where information travelled. Merchants shared news from other towns, travellers told stories from distant lands. Locals gossiped about who was sleeping with whom, who owed money, and who'd been caught stealing chickens. Political grumbling happened here too, quiet complaints about taxes, lords, and the general unfairness of life. And sometimes those complaints turned into something bigger. Peasant revolts often started in taverns, where angry men gathered, drank, and decided they'd had enough. The tavern was a spark, and sometimes that spark caught fire. In a world without newspapers, television, or internet, the tavern was where you got your news. A merchant would arrive from the next town over and share what he'd heard. A new tax had been announced. The harvest had failed in the south. The king was raising an army. People would crowd around, asking questions, debating the implications, and passing the information along to others. By the next day, the whole village would know. The accuracy of this news varied wildly. Some of it was true. Some was exaggerated. Some was completely invented by someone who wanted attention. But it was all you had, so you listened and tried to figure out what was real. Gossip was the tavern's lifeblood. Who was courting whom? Who'd been caught poaching? Whose crops were failing? Who'd been seen sneaking into the wrong house after dark? This wasn't idle chatter. It was social currency. Information was power, and knowing everyone's business gave you leverage. You could broker alliances, settle disputes, or ruin reputations, all from your seat on a wooden bench with a mug in your hand. Gossip also enforced community norms. If someone was behaving badly, cheating, stealing, mistreating their family, word would spread through the tavern and social pressure would follow. Public shame was a powerful tool in a small community. Travellers brought stories from beyond the village, tales of cities they'd visited, strange customs they'd witnessed, miracles they'd heard about. Some of these stories were true, most were embellished. A few were complete fabrications designed to impress a room full of people who'd never left their hometown. But it didn't matter. The stories opened windows to a wider world, sparking imaginations and giving people something to talk about for weeks. Remember that man who said he'd been to Rome? with the three-headed dog? That was Constantinople, and it was a statue. Still impressive. Political discontent simmered in taverns. When taxes were raised, when harvests failed, when lords made unpopular decisions, people complained. Loudly. They'd grumble about the unfairness, the corruption, the sense that the system was designed to crush them. These complaints were dangerous. Criticizing nobility or the crown could get you arrested. But in a tavern, surrounded by peers who felt the same way, people felt safe enough to speak their minds. The ale loosened tongues. The shared misery created solidarity. And sometimes that solidarity turned into action. Some of history's most famous peasant uprisings were born in taverns. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, for example, had roots in village gatherings where men drank, vented frustrations about poll taxes, and eventually decided to march on London. Taverns provided the space for organisation, the alcohol to fuel courage, and the community to create momentum. Revolutionary ideas spread the same way gossip did. One conversation at a time, one mug at a time, until suddenly a room full of angry peasants became a mob with pitchforks. Of course, most political grumbling never went anywhere. People would complain, vent, and then go home to their lives, too exhausted or too afraid to actually rebel. The authorities knew taverns were hotbeds of dissent, which is why they monitored them, raided them, and arrested people who spoke too freely. Spies and informants frequented taverns, listening for sedition, ready to report back to whoever paid them. You had to be careful. The wrong words to the wrong person could land you in prison, or worse. But the tavern remained essential. It was the town square, the community centre, the place where society came together to share, argue, laugh, and occasionally plot the overthrow of their oppressors. It was messy, chaotic, and often dangerous. But it was also vital. In a world where most people were illiterate, isolated and powerless, the tavern was one of the few places they could gather, speak freely, within limits, and feel like their voices mattered, even if only for a night. Drinking culture varied wildly across medieval Europe. In England, it was all about ale, thick, unhopped, and served at every meal. In Germany, beer was becoming an art form, with strict purity laws and professional brewers. In France, wine was king, and taverns were more refined, or at least pretended to be. In Scandinavia, mead made from fermented honey was the drink of choice. Each region had its own traditions, its own flavours, and its own ways of getting absolutely hammered. But the tavern experience, universally chaotic. English ale was the workhorse of medieval drinking. Brewed without hops, those wouldn't become standard until later. It was flavoured with whatever herbs were cheap and available. Groot, a mixture of herbs like yarrow, mugwort and heather, was the most common additive. The result was a thick, slightly sweet, earthy brew that didn't keep well and had to be consumed quickly. English taverns, called alehouses, were rough, informal places, often just someone's home with a barrel in the corner. You'd drink your ale warm because cold storage didn't exist, and you'd drink a lot of it because that's what everyone did. The English took their ale seriously, but not so seriously that they'd turn down a fight over it. In Germany, beer was evolving into something more sophisticated. By the late medieval period, German brewers were experimenting with hops, which acted as a preservative and gave beer a bitter, crisp flavour that English ale lacked. This allowed beer to be stored longer and transported farther, turning it into a valuable trade commodity. German taverns reflected this professionalism. They were often attached to breweries, run by guilds, and subject to strict regulations. The famous Reinheitsgebot, or beer purity law, was enacted in 1516, mandating that beer could only be made from water, barley and hops. Germans didn't mess around. Their beer was clean, consistent and consumed in quantities that would impress even the hardiest English drinker. France was a different world entirely. Wine was the drink of choice, and French taverns catered to a more refined, or at least more pretentious, clientele. Wine was produced in regions across France, from Burgundy to Bordeaux, and each region boasted about the superiority of its vintage. French taverns served wine in smaller portions than the massive mugs of ale common in England, and the atmosphere was slightly less chaotic. Slightly. There was still gambling, still fighting, still drunkenness. But there was also an air of sophistication, a sense that drinking wine made you more cultured than the beer-swilling Germans, or the ale-guzzling English. Whether this was true or just French arrogance is up for debate. In Scandinavia, mead ruled. Made from fermented honey, water, and sometimes spices or fruits, mead was sweet, strong, and deeply tied to Norse culture and mythology. It was the drink of warriors, of feasts in great halls, of Vikings toasting before raids. Scandinavian taverns, when they existed, were often communal spaces in larger households, or mead halls where entire communities gathered. The drinking was competitive. Who could consume the most without passing out was a mark of honour. Mead was expensive to produce because honey was valuable, so it was often reserved for special occasions. But when it flowed generously, and the celebrations were legendary. Italy had its own wine culture, distinct from France's. Italian wines were often mixed with water, herbs, or spices, creating flavoured beverages that were as much about medicinal properties as taste. Italian taverns, especially in cities like Florence and Venice, were lively, crowded, and filled with merchants, sailors, and travellers from across the Mediterranean. The atmosphere was cosmopolitan, the wine was cheap, and the arguments were passionate. Italians didn't just drink. They debated, gestured wildly, and turned every conversation into a performance. In Spain, wine was also dominant, often fortified or sweetened. Spanish taverns had a distinctly Moorish influence in some regions, with architectural styles and drinking customs shaped by centuries of cultural exchange. The drinks were strong, the food was flavourful, and the taverns were places where Christians, Muslims, and Jews, before the expulsions, would occasionally mingle, though tensions always simmered beneath the surface. Eastern Europe had its own traditions. In Poland and Russia, early forms of vodka and other grain-based spirits were beginning to appear, though they wouldn't dominate until later centuries. Kvass, a fermented beverage made from rye bread, was popular among common people. Eastern European taverns were raw, unpolished, and reflected the harsh climates and harder lives of the people who frequented them. But no matter where you were, whether you were drinking English ale, German beer, French wine, Scandinavian mead, or anything in between, the fundamentals remained the same. You gathered with others. You drank to forget, to celebrate, to connect. You told stories, sang songs, started fights, and stumbled home. The drinks changed, the languages changed, but the human need for community, escape, and a little liquid courage, that was universal. Running a tavern wasn't just hard work, it was legally complicated. Tavern keepers had to follow local laws about ale quality, pricing, and who they could serve. Inspectors called ale tasters would show up unannounced to test the beer and fine you if it was watered down or too weak. You needed a license, you had to pay taxes, and if a crime happened in your establishment, you could be held responsible. Raids were common. Authorities would storm in looking for fugitives, stolen goods, or just an excuse to collect fines. Being a tavern keeper meant walking a tightrope between profit and prison. Ale tasters were the bane of every tavern keeper's existence. These were local officials, usually appointed by the Lord or Town Council, whose job was to ensure that ale met minimum quality standards and was sold at fair prices. They'd show up without warning, demand a sample, and taste it right there in front of you. If they deemed it too weak, too watered down, or just generally terrible, you'd be fined on the spot. The fines weren't small either. They could wipe out a week's profits or more. Some ale tasters were fair and professional. Others were corrupt, demanding bribes to overlook substandard ale, or inventing violations to justify fines. Either way, you couldn't refuse them. They had the law on their side. The quality control system, called the Assize of Ale, was designed to protect consumers from being cheated. It set standards for strength, pricing, and measurement. But in practice, it was a minefield. Ale naturally varied in quality depending on ingredients, weather, and the brewer's skill. What one taster considered acceptable, another might condemn, and because brewing was done in small batches, consistency was nearly impossible. You'd have a great batch one week and a terrible one the next, and there was no predicting when the taster would show up. Licensing was another headache. To legally sell ale, you needed permission from local authorities. This required fees, paperwork, such as it was in a largely illiterate society, and approval from people who had the power to deny you on a whim. Some lords granted licenses freely, seeing taverns as sources of tax revenue. Others restricted them, fearing that too many taverns would lead to disorder. If you operated without a license, you were breaking the law, and the penalties range from fines to having your stock confiscated to being shut down entirely. Taxes were relentless. You paid taxes on the ale you brewed. You paid taxes on the building. You paid taxes on the income. Tax collectors were frequent visitors, and they kept meticulous records, or at least they claimed to. Disputing their calculations was risky. You might win, but you'd also make an enemy who'd come back next month with even more aggressive demands. Most tavern keepers just paid, grumbled quietly, and built the cost into their prices, which meant customers ended up paying the taxes indirectly. Liability was a constant worry. If someone got stabbed in your tavern, authorities might hold you accountable for not maintaining order. If stolen goods were found on your premises, you could be accused of receiving them, even if you had no knowledge. If a fugitive was caught hiding in your inn, you'd be questioned about whether you'd knowingly harboured them. The presumption was often guilt, and proving innocence required time, money, and connections you probably didn't have. Raids were terrifying and disruptive. Bailiffs or soldiers would burst in, usually at night when the tavern was full, and start searching. They'd overturn tables, interrogate patrons, and confiscate anything suspicious. Sometimes they had specific targets: a known criminal, contraband goods. Other times it was a fishing expedition, hoping to catch someone doing something illegal so they could collect fines or make arrests. Your customers would scatter, your reputation would take a hit. And even if nothing was found, you'd spend the rest of the night cleaning up the mess and wondering when they'd come back. Some tavern keepers tried to stay on the right side of the law by cooperating with authorities. They'd report suspicious activity, refuse service to known troublemakers, and keep their establishments as orderly as possible. Others took a different approach, bribing officials, hiding fugitives for a fee, and operating just outside the law's reach. Both strategies had risks. Cooperation might protect you from raids, but it could also make you a target for criminals who saw you as a snitch. Operating in the grey area might be profitable, but one wrong move could land you in prison. The legal burden of running a tavern was immense, and it wore people down. The constant threat of fines, raids, and liability meant that tavern keeping was as much about legal survival as it was about brewing good ale. You weren't just managing a business. You were navigating a hostile regulatory environment designed to extract money and control behaviour. And through it all, you still had to serve drinks, break up fights, and smile at customers who had no idea how close you were to losing everything. Despite everything, the terrible ale, the fights, the fleas, the hangovers, the risk of death, people kept going back to taverns. Why? Because there was nowhere else to go. If you were a medieval peasant, your life was work, sleep, church, and more work. The tavern was the one place where you could sit down, talk to other people, laugh, sing, and forget, even for a few hours, that your existence was brutal and short. It wasn't paradise. But it was yours, a little corner of warmth and chaos in a cold, unforgiving world, and sometimes that was enough. Let's be clear about what medieval life offered in terms of leisure. Almost nothing. There were no movie theatres, no coffee shops, no parks with benches where you could sit and people watch. There were no gyms, no hobby clubs, no community centres. Your options for socialising were limited to church, where you had to be quiet and respectful, market days, where you were busy buying turnips, and the tavern. That was it. The tavern wasn't competing with other entertainment options. It was the only option, and that gave it enormous power in people's lives. Work consumed most of your waking hours. If you were a farmer, you were in the fields from dawn until dusk, breaking your back for crops that might or might not survive the season. If you were a craftsman, you were in your workshop doing the same repetitive tasks day after day. If you were a labourer, you were hauling, digging, building, until your muscles screamed and your mind went numb. Work wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't something you did for personal growth or satisfaction. It was survival, and it was exhausting. By the time you finished, you were too tired to do much of anything, except drink. The tavern offered something work couldn't: relief. Not just physical relief, though sitting down after 12 hours of labour felt like a gift from God, but mental and emotional relief. A chance to stop thinking about the harvest, the taxes, the Lord's demands, the ever-present threat of starvation. For a few hours, those problems existed somewhere else, in a future you didn't have to deal with right now. You could just be, exist, breathe, drink, and for people whose lives were defined by relentless pressure, that was invaluable. Human connection was another reason people returned. Medieval life could be desperately lonely, even when you were surrounded by family. You worked alongside the same people every day, but the work was often silent, focused, repetitive. Conversations were brief and functional. Pass the scythe. Watch the ox. It's going to rain. The tavern was where you actually talked, where you told jokes, shared stories, complained about your neighbours, and bonded over shared misery. You'd sit next to someone you barely knew, and after a few mugs feel like you'd known them your whole life. That sense of belonging, of community, was rare and precious. Laughter was another scarce commodity. Medieval life wasn't funny. It was hard, dangerous, and often tragic. But in the tavern, after enough ale, everything became a little funnier. The absurdity of your situation, the ridiculousness of the nobleman who'd ridden through town that morning, the time your friend fell into the pig pen. You'd laugh until your sides hurt, until tears ran down your face, and for those moments, the weight of existence lifted. Laughter was medicine, and the tavern was the only place you could get it. The tavern also offered a sense of control, however illusory. You chose to go there. You chose what to drink, who to talk to, when to leave. In a world where almost every aspect of your life was dictated by lords, weather and chance, having even a tiny bit of agency felt empowering. You weren't just a cog in the feudal machine, you were a person making decisions, even if those decisions were mostly about how drunk to get. And then there was hope. Not hope for a better future, that was too abstract, too unlikely. But hope that tonight might be different. Maybe tonight you'd win at dice. Maybe tonight someone would buy you a drink. Maybe tonight you'd make a friend, impress someone, hear a story that would stay with you for years. Maybe tonight would be the good night that made all the bad nights worth enduring. That hope, fragile and often disappointed, kept people coming back. The tavern wasn't perfect. It was dirty, dangerous, expensive, and often disappointing. But it was also human. A place where people gathered not because they had to, but because they needed to. Because the alternative, going home to a cold, dark hut and sitting alone with your thoughts, was worse. The tavern offered warmth, noise, company, and the promise that for a little while you didn't have to face the world alone. And in the end, that's why people kept coming back. Not because the ale was good, not because the company was refined, but because it was there. A refuge, however flawed, in a world that offered very few. A place where, just for a moment, life felt a little less impossible. So, how was your night out in medieval Europe? You survived the smoky tavern, the questionable ale, the fights, the fleas, and the very real possibility of being stabbed over a dice game. You sang bawdy songs with strangers, ate meat of unknown origin, and woke up with a hangover that could kill a horse and significantly lighter pockets. Congratulations. You've experienced what passed for a good time in the 14th century. Looking back, it's almost impressive how much suffering people were willing to endure just for a few hours of companionship and forgetting. The ale tasted like fermented sadness. The food was a health hazard. The entertainment was watching drunk people make terrible decisions, and yet night after night people showed up. Because in a world defined by backbreaking labour, crushing poverty, and the constant threat of death, the tavern was one of the few places where life felt bearable, where you could laugh, connect, and feel, however briefly, like you mattered. Medieval taverns weren't glamorous. They were messy, chaotic, and occasionally deadly, but they were also deeply human. They were where communities formed, where news spread, where revolutions began. They were where people fell in love, made friends, and told stories that would be remembered long after they were gone. The tavern was a mirror of medieval life itself, brutal, unfair, and strangely beautiful in its resilience. The people who filled those taverns, the farmers, the merchants, the alewives, the drunks, the dreamers, they didn't have much. But they had each other, even if only for a night. They had songs that made them laugh and ale that made them brave. They had the stubborn, reckless hope that tomorrow might be slightly less terrible than today. And somehow, against all odds, they kept going. One mug at a time, one night at a time, one bad decision at a time. So tonight, as you settle into your clean bed with your temperature-controlled room and your access to clean water and medical care, take a moment to appreciate what you have, because your ancestors, those brave, foolish, ale-soaked souls, survived taverns where the floor was dirt, the drinks were poison, and the entertainment was mortality. They survived so you could complain about your latte being slightly too hot. History isn't always grand battles and great kings. Sometimes it's just ordinary people in a smoky room, drinking bad beer and trying to forget that life is hard. And honestly, that's beautiful in its own weird, uncomfortable, flea-infested way. Sweet dreams. And maybe don't drink anything that's been sitting in a wooden barrel for 3 weeks.